Hello YouTube. Rumbling sounds coming from a cloudless sky don't usually attract attention these days. People think that somewhere far away an airplane is breaking the sound barrier. They don't know that mysterious gunshots were heard near seas and large lakes long before the advent of aviation. For the first time, Indian scientists who worked for the British colonialists in the 19th century drew attention to this mysterious rumble. Babu Gaurdas Baisak, speaking at a meeting of the Bengal Asiatic Society in 1867, mentioned that in the Ganges Delta, one often hears a series of sounds similar to distant cannon shots. They sound loudest after a storm and during a calm. In the city of Barisal, which is now located in Bangladesh, the phenomenon was as common as monsoons or rains. Over time, it began to be called Barisal guns, although the roar did not have a clear geographical reference. The noise could be heard by both locals and Europeans who, by the will of fate, found themselves in the lower reaches of the Ganges or in the Bay of Bengal. One of them was a certain G.B. Scott, who described his impressions in the journal Nature. Here it goes. I first heard the Barisal guns in December of 1871 when I was traveling from Calcutta to Assam via Sundarban. The weather was fine and calm, with no signs of a storm. All day long, the noise on board the steamer prevented us from hearing other sounds, but when everything quieted down at night, and we moored in one narrow strait or another in the vicinity of Barisal, Morelgang, and upstream, far from any villages or other settlements, where the jungle overgrown with grass stretches for miles on all sides, and the only sounds were the splashing of waves or the earth falling into the water from the shores they had washed away. At irregular intervals before, there was a dull rumble, similar to a distant cannon shot. Sometimes there was one shot, sometimes two, three or more in a row, never close, always far, but not always equally far. Sometimes the shots resembled a cannonade of two opposing forces quite apart from each other, and sometimes they came from different directions, but apparently they always came from the south, that is, from the sea. We were near the sea when I first heard them, and when I told an elderly lady on board that I had heard the roar of a cannon in the distance, she told me for the first time about the mysterious sounds known as Barisal guns. I especially remember a quiet Sunday in May, spent with a friend in Chilmari, near the riverbank. About 10 a.m. in clear and calm weather, we were walking back and forth along the shore, discussing these sounds, when we distinctly heard a roar about as loud as if a heavy cannon were firing 10 miles downriver on a quiet day. Soon after, we heard a strong rumble much closer, still in the south. Suddenly, two rapidly following sounds were heard, more like close shots from a pistol or a musket, but not from a rifle. It seemed to me that they thundered in the air, about 150 yards to the west of us, over the water. My friend thought that they were coming from north of us. We ran to the shore and asked our boatmen moored below if they had heard the sounds, and if so, in which direction. They pointed south. A year earlier, I discussed the sounds with Captain Stewart from the Indian Exploration Department, who participated in this study of Sundarban tracts a few years ago. He said that this rumble was heard all over the Sundarbank, and that several experts were unable to explain it. Henry Schur, district superintendent of Bengal police, traveled extensively in the Ganges Delta and heard a mysterious noise more than once. His official report, however, differs from what we have just read. Schur claimed that the Barisal guns always sound 3 times, although other eyewitnesses did not notice such a pattern, and then denied that they could be heard in calm weather. Barisal guns can be heard at a great distance, from Pergan through Khulna, Baker Gunji, Noakhali, as well as along the shores of Meghna to Narayan Gunji and Dhaka. They are most clearly and often heard in the Bakar Gunji area, or Baker Gunji area, where they got their name. Gunshots are most often heard from February to October and rarely in November, December, or January. One of the very noticeable features is their absence in good weather. They are heard only immediately before, during, or immediately after heavy rains. The direction they come from is always south or southeast. I heard them to the west of me when I was in the extreme south of the district, but never to the north of me. The captains of the river steamers told me that they heard this rumble in the north. These gentlemen, however, apply waters beyond my observation on the mainland and adjacent waters. Shots are always fired in threes, that is, 3 shots are always fired, one after the other at regular intervals, and although several shots may be heard, their number is always 3 or a multitude of 3. The interval between these 3 shots is always constant. The interval between the first and the second coincides with the interval between the second and third, and is usually 3 seconds, although it sometimes increases to 10 seconds. However, the interval between 3 shots varies greatly, from a few seconds to hours and days. Sometimes you can hear only one series of 3 shots in a day, and in other cases such series follow each other with great accuracy, and I counted up to 45 of them, one after the other, without pauses. The sound is exactly like shots from a large caliber guns heard from afar, with the only difference that the sound is always double, that is, it has an echo. The shots don't differ much in volume, and I can't recall there being much difference in sound, regardless of whether it was heard in Barisal itself or about 70-80 miles to the south, on the very edge of the country. The state of the atmosphere may affect this, but only to a small extent. That's what he said. Well, many years later, Babu Gaurdas Baisak returned to the phenomenon of mysterious sounds and presented the data he had collected to his European colleagues. I hardly need to apologize for returning to the topic of the physical phenomenon known as Barisal cannons, a topic too important and interesting to overlook or forget. That's what Babu Gardas Baisak wrote. My goal is to record some facts that have attracted my attention since, as I believe this topic was first raised at a meeting of the Society in 1867. I ask you not only to draw the attention of scientific gentlemen to them, but also to organize a system of research and observations in order to come to a solution to the problem. You already know that these sounds resemble the rumble of a distant cannonade, and that they are usually heard between April and September, when there is a lull after a squall or after heavy rain, or when the clouds begin to disperse. They are so called because they were first seen in Barisal, but the area where such sounds are heard is vast. They can be heard high upriver, for example in Furijpur, and throughout the south of Bakerganj and Jessore Nakhulna, especially in the vicinity of the Belshwar River. The facts that have recently become known to me show that the honor of hearing these mysterious fireworks falls not only to the share of the places listed above. Similar sounds I heard in Tamluk, and I personally heard them clearly. When I was temporarily in charge of an army unit in April and May 1883, and was living in a government bungalow, which at that time was only 25 feet from the edge of the high bank of the Rupna Rayan River, in the afternoon between 1 and 2 p.m., after a heavy rain, I heard sounds like distant cannon shots. Their similarity to what I knew as the Barisal guns immediately attracted attention and aroused curiosity. I asked the oldest residents, and they told me that they had been used to hearing these sounds since childhood, but they did not know how to explain them. At least there was no superstitious legend associated with them. I took the opportunity to send a dinghy up and down the river for several miles to find out if large masses of earth had collapsed somewhere, but nothing was found. That would confirm the theory of those who attribute the rumble to such a cause. When I mentioned this fact to Mr. Medlicott, he told me that he had heard from his friend that similar sounds were heard in Cherrapunji. Babu Karunadas Bose, from the Judicial Service, a resident of Dhaka, wrote to me that strange explosions can be heard in Vikrapur and more often in rainy than in dry weather, but never in Dhaka. These places are far from the seashore, and this fact directly refutes the theory that the surf breaks on the seashore and causes noise, a theory that seems to have appealed to some learned gentlemen. Referring to the theory of surf, it is said that the transmission of sound waves is very dependent on environmental conditions, and when they are favorable, the sound spreads over vast distances. However, I cannot imagine that these conditions could be so different that the Parisol guns could be clearly heard in Tamluk and completely inaudible in Diamond Harbor, a coastal city. The Bengalis Asian Society supported Baisak's initiative and decided to allocate funds for the organization of scientific observation of the Barisal cannons. Observers were sent to the settlements of the Ganges Delta to carefully monitor the strange rumble, noting the exact time and number of shots, the state of the weather at that time, and other important details. Alas, the records that were kept from 1888 to 1889 did not help to get closer to the solution. The scientists were most surprised by the fact that not only the time but also the days when the rumble was heard did not coincide with observers from different places. This immediately made it possible to dismiss the single cause of the sounds. The phenomenon was local and in each place its own. The first president of the Theosophical Society, Colonel Henry Olcott, allowed himself a lot of irony about the failure of European science. He drew attention to a unique case contained in the final report of the society. The observer Waller, riding up to his house and approaching the porch 50 yards away, did not hear the guns, while the porter, who was standing on the steps waiting for the owner, heard them. Is this consistent with any of the discussed physical theories? Already in the middle of the 20th century, Dr. M.V. Chiplonkar from Bombay University mapped the places where the Barisal guns are heard and the places where they are never heard. The result was amazing. The map turned out to be quite colorful. Although the Ganges Delta is flat, there are no mountains or hills that can delay the sound. No less strange was that the sounds were heard even in Assam, at a great distance from the sea. The propagation of sounds turned out to be independent even of the wind direction. The roar from the south could be heard both in the wind and against it. When all the causes of the atmospheric origin were rejected, scientists had to turn to seismology. During an earthquake, and sometimes just before it, eyewitnesses often hear a rumble or a strong roar. This was also the case during the earthquake that shook India on June 12, 1897. The superintendent of the Geological Survey, R.D. Oldham, the author of a detailed report on the scale of the earthquake and the damage it caused, concluded that the mystery had been solved. As for this earthquake, the reports from Kohima mentioned that shortly, one of them says 15 minutes, after the quake, 3 loud explosive sounds were heard, apparently coming from the south or southwest. It is said that similar sounds were heard in Woach and Lamding. Another story that can be quoted belongs to Mr. A.E., an Englishman, a member of the Calcutta Engineering Society. So here's what he said. According to the diary, it was June 12th. The time was between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. Upon returning from a walk after hunting in a jungle camp on the banks of the Taingale, about 7 miles southwest of the village of Keko, and about 19 miles east of Tagaung, I noticed that the water in a shallow reservoir, about 300 yards long, was lapping against the shore under my tent. The hunters said that it must be elephants swimming, but when we looked, we saw that there was no one at the other end of the village. Then someone pointed to the shaken trees, and we realized that it must be an earthquake. As far as I remember, after about half an hour or less, I heard 1 or 2 distinct rumbles, like cannon shots, left the tent and joined my hunters and escorts, who also came out, listened and counted. We counted about 25 distinct explosions, with an interval of about 3-4 seconds. They were about as loud and distinct as a shot from a 7-pound cannon at a distance of, say, 4 miles or more, if the terrain is very flat. After these 25 strokes, there were some less distinct rumbling sounds. We were thinking about the reason, and the hunters and I came to the conclusion that it must have been heavy guns fired from a steamer in Tagaung or on the river. At the same time, no one thought that the sounds were caused by an earthquake. After asking several carters, Maungas from Pangong, 2 miles northeast of Tagaung, who arrived the next morning, if they had heard the sounds and what they were, I heard, yes, cannons were fired in Tagaung or on the west bank of the river. In Tagaung, I learned that the sounds were coming from the northwest. It was only when I made inquiries on board the steamer Mogaung and learned that there had been no heavy cannon fire that I came to the conclusion that the sounds must have been caused by an earthquake. At the time of the incidents, I thought that shooting was a training exercise or in connection with the upcoming anniversary. It rained very heavily on the 11th, 12th, 13th, and the 15th. There were no tremors, and if it hadn't been for the splashing of water, we would not have noticed them. The sounds came to us from the west-northwest of Taingale. They were completely different from the earthquake sounds I had heard before, completely confusing me and the hunters, who are very knowledgeable in the sounds of the jungle. That's what he said. It is also said that similar sounds were heard in Sigyaing and Maulu in the Katha area. In the first case, 4 loud gunshots were heard before the shock. In the second, they were heard after. Other reports from places in North Bengal mentioned sounds similar to the distant artillery volleys. But here we will not mention them since it was impossible to understand from them whether they refer simply to the usual rumble or to the unusual sounds in question. It can be seen that the short explosive sounds mentioned here, like those that accompanied the earthquakes of 1869 and 1881, were relatively local in distribution. The areas over which they were heard were removed from the epicenter, and the explosive sounds, although clearly related to the earthquake, followed it many minutes later. The cause of the sounds is currently unclear, and although several assumptions could be made, more complete and detailed information is required before a definite opinion can be expressed. However, one thing seems obvious: the delay between the passage of an earthquake shock and hearing the sounds of an explosion is too great to be explained by the slower speed of propagation of the sound wave in the air, as in the case of the interval between a flash of lightning and a thunderclap. Superintendent Oldham seems to have violated the main rule of logic here. After does not mean as a result. The significant gap between the impact of the earthquake and the sounds only means that the Borisov guns thundered at the wrong time, when everyone was agitated by the shaking of the ground. A witness who had previously heard the earthquake rumble immediately noted the difference in the nature of the sounds, but Oldham did not pay attention to this. When seismic stations appeared in India, not only in large cities, it became clear that the roar of the Borisov guns rarely coincides with the Earth's vibrations. In Europe, interest in the Borisov guns was aroused only after George Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, mentioned them in the journal Nature. Here's what he said: in the Ganges Delta, muffled sounds are often heard, more or less resembling the distant rumble of artillery. They are called Borisov guns, but I do not know the meaning of this term. The purpose of my article is to draw the attention of readers of the magazine to this mysterious phenomenon and similar mist puffers of the Belgian coast. A few days ago, a letter from Mr. Van den Broek, curator of the Natural History Museum of Belgium, caught my attention. He writes about some curious aerial or underground explosions that are quite often heard, at least in Belgium and northern France, and which are undoubtedly widespread, although little known because most people mistake them for the sounds of distant artillery. I have constantly heard these sounds on the Limburg Plain since 1880, and my colleague from Geological Survey, Monsieur Routot, has heard them very often on the Belgian coast, where our sailors call them mist puffers. The lighthouse keeper at Ostend has been hearing these sounds for the past few years. They are known near Boulogne, and the late Monsieur Huzeau told my friend Monsieur Lancaster about them. More than 10 of my friends have heard them. The sounds are muffled and distant. They are repeated dozens or more times with an irregular frequency. They can usually be heard during the day when the sky is clear, and especially in the late afternoon after a very hot day. These sounds don't sound at all like artillery firing, explosions in mines, or distant thunder. Mr. Van den Broek, mentioning the Borisov guns, says that he has inclined to consider them as the result of some special discharge of atmospheric electricity, but my colleague Monsieur Routot believes that they come from underground. He compares this noise to the impacts of an internal liquid mass that can cause in the earth crust. Mr. Clement Reid informed Van den Broek that, in his opinion, similar noises are heard on Dartmoor and in some parts of Scotland. I never heard of anything like this in those parts before. Before starting any systematic observations, it will be useful to get some general idea of how common such sounds are and their geographical distribution. Will any of the numerous readers of the magazine in different parts of the world share their experience on this issue? Readers responded, and it soon became clear that rumbling sounds are known everywhere, where there are exits to the sea or at least a large lake. In many countries, they were given folk nicknames. In England, folk guns. In the Netherlands, zeepoffers, hiccups of the sea. In Italy, brontidi, thunderous. In Germany, shishabien, sea shooting. And in the USA and Canada, sea farts, etc. Reports of rumbling have repeatedly been received from Australia, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and other exotic places, including Russia. On Lake Ladoga, brantids have been observed since 1911, and the ice on the surface of water does not interfere with them. By the way, I have several videos about Lake Ladoga, and you can read about this strange phenomenon in them in great detail. Let's get back. The same thing was noticed in Ireland. The priest W.S. Smith from Antrim described his acquaintance with rumbling sounds as follows. Loch Ness is a body of water covering over 150 miles with very gradually decreasing shores, except in one or two places. For many years after I moved here from England as a priest, I occasionally heard sounds like cannon shots near the lake, but not being familiar with the geography of remote shores, the location of cities, or the occupations of the population, I began to think that the rumble was coming from quarries or, on fine summer days, from celebrations in Derry or Tyrone. Over time, I realized that the sounds were not coming from the opposite shore, but from the lake itself. After asking many local residents, I turned to the fishermen, but they could not explain this reason either. The strangest thing is that people, as a rule, do not know anything about this phenomenon, and it is shrouded in mystery. I've heard the rumble maybe 20 times this year. Last winter, for the first time since 1814, the entire Loch Ness was covered with ice. One day, when air was calm, I was skating in the neighborhood of Shandy Castle, and the mystical cannons were rumbling every 5 to 6 minutes. On the last day of skiing, when thousands of people from Belfast and other places gathered in Antrim Bay, there were two terrible rumbles that made everyone who was next to me shudder. They apparently thought that some terrible catastrophe had occurred, as the sounds seemed to come from no more than half a mile away. I've never heard them so close before. The ice in Antrim Bay remained the same as it was. I later learned that 6 miles away, it began to split, but there were no disturbing sounds. That's what he wrote. Now, geologist Van den Broek from Belgium mentioned in a note by Darwin, collected and summarized about 100 eyewitness accounts. He published these materials in the journal Ciel et Terre for 1895-1896, and then published them in a separate book. Van den Broek found that sounds can be heard mainly in hot and windless weather, both during a cyclone and during an anticyclone, when there is fog over the sea. He also came to the conclusion that the rumble, which cannot be explained by the anomalous propagation of sounds from quarries where dynamite is used or military landfills, may have a seismic origin, although this hypothesis has not been confirmed by anything. In 1933, the Dutch meteorologist W. Blecker reanalyzed the data on thunderous sounds collected in the Netherlands on the initiative of Van den Broek in 1896 to 1903. He found that the monthly distribution of mist buffers almost perfectly coincides with the distribution of thunderstorm days. Does this mean that the mist buffers are just a distorted sound of distant thunder or some kind of phenomenon related to atmospheric electricity? It is unlikely because the author himself wrote that the mysterious rumble could be a day ahead of the thunderstorm or sound when it ended. Rather, the point is that the conditions conducive to mist buffers, hot and calm weather, at the same time contribute to the appearance of thunderstorms. This is a good example of false correlation, when the coincidences are random or depend on a third variable that is not on the graph. If you plot a graph linking ice cream sales in a city to the number of people who drowned, the correlation will be excellent, but it does not follow that the dead drowned because of the ice cream. There is a third variable here, the heat, which has led to both an increase in ice cream sales and an increase in the number of swimmers, and consequently, an increase in the number of accidents on the water. Over time, scientists began to put forward the most bizarre hypotheses out of desperation. In 1979, Thomas Gold and Stephen Sauter suggested that the sounds were made by gases escaping from the ground. They can ignite and explode, which significantly increases the noise. Needless to say, this theory was received very skeptically. Geologist Donald Stearman from the University of California said that the release of gas under high pressure is not able to generate strong sounds. During the emissions in Kansas and Oklahoma, mud and water flew 10 meters into the air without any noise, and the gas did not catch fire. This requires a combination of rare conditions. But even this hypothesis pales in comparison to one put forward in 2020 by Dmitry Butker, Viktor Flambaum, and Ariel Zhitnitsky. In their opinion, the mysterious rumble in the air is produced by particles of dark matter, clusters of axion quarks entering the Earth's atmosphere. Even if we believe that the hypothetical axion quarks exist, the rumbling in the sky should be chaotic and not confined to coasts or dependent on the state of the atmosphere. The barisol guns are not just audible, they can be recorded with a microphone or a barograph. On the evening of July 31, 2008, they thundered over Lake Huron, Canada. The infrasound tracking station for meteors entering the atmosphere, located near the Eggenfield Observatory, recorded the distinct sounds of two explosions, marked in red, followed by vibrations inaudible to the ear, marked in green, and finally something like thunderclaps, marked in blue. Experts have ruled out the possibility of a large bolide exploding in the atmosphere, a supersonic aircraft flying over, or any military or industrial activity. Paul Dennis Sporer, having studied the recording made on October 6, 2011, in the vicinity of Chester, New York, using specially developed acoustic, graphical, and statistical methods, concluded, it becomes clear that we cannot attribute the sounds to anything known. They are the product of a large-scale, highly developed system with a reliable structure, hence the sounds. They are extraordinary not only because of the rarity of the occurrence, but also because they indicate a complex phenomenon containing mechanisms in its structure that operate according to precise mathematical principles that differ from those that have been studied in nature so far. Paul Dennis Sporer clearly means the phenomenon that generates sounds cannot be of natural origin. An unknown something uses the water surface as a resonator, a source of energy, or perhaps it is connected to a liquid in ways we do not understand. It is pointless to speculate about its nature and the meaning of the sounds it creates. We don't even know if the sounds are meant for us or are a byproduct of the activity, like the crackle of a motor or the croaking of frogs. Of course, Paul Dennis Sporer may be wrong, but in any case, the strange rumble deserves a lot more attention than scientists have given it. This is another anomaly that has the potential to open doors to unknown abysses and radically change our understanding of the universe. This study was done by Mikhail Gerstein, who is the best of Russia's ufologists, an experienced field researcher, author of many wonderful books, hundreds of articles, a scientist and a thinker. And from time to time I bring information that he comes up with, and his materials, his ideas. But I want to add that I heard also about such strange sounds in the Northern California, I believe also in Oregon, and I'm sure you also might have heard something wherever you are. And definitely this is an anomaly that we need to study more if we have the wherewithal to do so. Thank you for your attention to my work and materials I bring you. And if you can support my research, you can do so through the links you'll find in the description to this video. Please like my videos, subscribe to my channel.